The Israeli government has approved a major expansion of the IDF's operation in the Gaza Strip, including the complete takeover of Gaza City. We're going to talk about the details as far as we know about this new plan. Why is this happening now? How is this different than the previous IDF activities in Gaza over the last almost 2 years? And the intentions to relocate close to 1 million Palestinians to a new humanitarian zone. We're also going to talk about the ongoing fighting in the Gaza Strip. Has there been any improvement in the humanitarian situation in Gaza? What's going on with the hostage negotiations? And Lebanon's recent vote to disarm Hezbollah. This is the Israel-Palestine Report with Professor Alon Burstein. Let's dive in. On Thursday, August 8th, the Israeli cabinet voted in favor of a proposal initiated by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu involving a major expansion of Israel's military activity in the Gaza Strip. The plan is to take over the southern parts of Gaza City over a 5-month period before turning to the central regions of the Gaza Strip and taking them over as well. Now, there's been a lot of confusion about this plan in the last several days, and specifically, how does it differ from what the Israeli military has been doing until now over the last 22 months? So I'm going to devote the majority of this summary to giving some information about where things stand in the Gaza Strip right now, why would implementing this plan in Gaza constitute a different phase in the fighting, and how is this different than what has been going on over the last almost 2 years, before turning to a more concise summary of the events that have happened over the last week. Before I continue, I'm going to remind everyone, if you have not yet, hit that subscribe button to stay up to date on all the recent developments in the war and in the region more broadly. So, where do things stand in the Gaza Strip right now, and why is this plan different? Right now, the Israeli military controls roughly 70 to 75% of the territory in the Gaza Strip, and that is where the bulk of the fighting has been happening over the last almost 2 years. This territory includes the entire area of Rafah, the most southern city in the Gaza Strip, that is severed by a corridor that the IDF established, the Morag corridor, over here. It also includes the eastern parts of Han Yunis, the largest city in Gaza and the second big city in southern Gaza. That is this area over here. The IDF established another corridor called the Magen Oz corridor that severs that area over here. In addition to that, the IDF has also taken a lot of territory in Gaza City, in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, this area over here, all except for the southern parts of Gaza City and the western parts, these areas right there. And also the IDF controls a lot of areas in what's known as the buffer zone, that is the area along the border with Israel, all along the strip, right over there. So, all these areas have been declared combat zones by the IDF, and the military has called on Palestinians to evacuate from them. The result of that fighting and the IDF issuing those evacuation orders has been that the majority of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, some 2 million people, are now located in the remaining 25% of the Gaza Strip. That is in the Al-Muwasi refugee camp, the area in southern Gaza over here, the central parts of the Gaza Strip, the major city Deir el-Balah and its associated refugee camps, and again in the southern parts of Gaza City, these areas over here. Taking over that 75% of the Gaza Strip in all those different areas has been the main thing that the IDF has been doing over the last several months, the operation that was known as Gideon's Chariots. That started on May 18th and is now reportedly coming to an end. The Israeli military is saying it has completed taking up those positions and now needs to receive orders from the Israeli government. It's also important to note that that operation was meant to apply pressure on Hamas, as the Israeli military was supposed to take up permanent positions in the areas in Gaza, and in Israel was reported that there is a hope that Hamas will then prefer a hostage deal and a truce in order to stop the ongoing fighting. So, why has the IDF not invaded those remaining 25% where there is the majority of Palestinians and still a lot of Hamas activity, and what is changing? For each one of those areas, there's a bit of a different reason as to why the military has avoided using ground forces in those areas. In the Al-Muwasi refugee camp, again, that is the southern region over here, that area was very sparsely populated prior to the war, and thus when the war broke out, Israel declared that as the humanitarian zone in Gaza, and close to 1 million, at times even 1.8 million Palestinians had crammed into that area. That resulted in the fact that the Israeli military did not actually invade with ground forces into there, but rather shied away from it. There were some airstrikes that were carried out in that area and increasing in recent months, but no ground activity has been mobilized into that region. In Gaza City, in turn, in the northern parts over here, the Israeli military did take over that area at the beginning of 2024, and Palestinians who had evacuated from it were not allowed to return for almost a year. However, as part of the hostage deal of 2025 in January, Israel evacuated the Netzarim corridor, that area that severed northern Gaza, and Palestinians were then allowed to return north, and even after they returned to fighting, the IDF retook the corridor, but not completely, leaving some pathways for Palestinians to continue to return north. As a result, since the beginning of 2025, some 800,000 Palestinians who had previously evacuated from northern Gaza have since returned to those areas, situating primarily in the southwestern parts over here. That is where the majority of fighting has not been taking place, and that area is now very, very densely populated. With regard to the central camps, again, these areas in Deir el-Balah and the refugee camps, it is reported that the Israeli intelligence had estimated that since the war began, the majority of hostages had been held in those areas, leading the IDF to avoid any ground activity in that region. As a result, despite 22 months of intensive fighting, Hamas's Al-Qassam brigades still hold roughly 2 battalions in those central camps in the Gaza Strip, and the group has also reportedly rebuilt its strength in northern parts of Gaza, in those southern areas of Gaza City. The IDF's recent estimates are that the Al-Qassam brigades have now replenished their fighting forces in those 2 areas to between 10,000 to 15,000 fighters. So, what did the Israeli government approve, and why has this come under such condemnation, both from international forces as well as within Israel? Following the collapse of the hostage negotiations between 2 to 3 weeks ago, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu brought forth a plan for the IDF to gradually take over that remaining 25% of Gaza, thus leaving Hamas no area where it can de facto control. In order to do this, the plan involves a mass evacuation of Palestinian civilians from each of those areas into the other regions of Gaza, of the Gaza Strip, where, according to that plan, humanitarian aid will be provided for those, again, internally displaced Palestinians. The aim, again, according to the Israeli government, is to distinguish between the population and the Hamas operatives in the region, and following the evacuation of the civilians, Israel will declare an absolute siege on those areas that have been evacuated, i.e., after, for example, the evacuation of southern parts of the Gaza City, there will be an absolute siege and no more humanitarian aid will be allowed into that area. According to Israel, that is supposed to both draw the remaining civilians out of the region, and the IDF will then be able to move in, assuming that the only ones that remain are the Hamas operatives. According to reports from the past several days, the operation is supposed to take between 5 to 6 months and will begin in that southern area of Gaza City, the northern parts of the Strip. Israel's Khan News Network also reported that evacuation orders will be issued to the entire northern region in the coming weeks, and that Palestinian civilians will be evacuated gradually from that area over the next 2 months, culminating, according to reports, on October 7th of 2025. According to, again, Israel's Khan News Network, the siege will then begin in the region, and by October 25th, the IDF will then move into that area. Now, as I said, the approval of these plans met with almost unprecedented international condemnation of Israel, and there's also been a lot of internal criticism, both from Israel's security establishment and from segments of the Israeli population, of the approval of this plan. So in order to understand that, it's important to contextualize what is different about this plan. Why is this all of a sudden raising alarm bells across the world? How is this different than what has happened over the last 22 months? First, it's the sheer magnitude of the evacuation of Palestinian civilians that is being discussed. And it is also important to know that it's extremely reminiscent of the first weeks of the war back in October of 2023, when over 1 million Palestinians became internally displaced and were mobilized towards the southern parts of the Gaza Strip. Again, what we're talking about right now in the initial stages is the evacuation of almost 1 million Palestinians from the areas of northern Gaza, and then possibly another close to 1 million Palestinians from the central parts of the Gaza Strip. Throughout the war since that initial evacuation, all of the evacuations of Palestinians have been much smaller and more gradual in scale. And also it's important to note that while this plan theoretically, again, moves Palestinians towards a humanitarian zone, right now, as opposed to in October 2023, the majority of the southern parts of the Gaza Strip are completely destroyed. The areas have been flattened or are in ruins, and thus the people that are now going to be again internally displaced don't really have where to go. A second facet is the possible aftermath of such a move. As it stands right now, the only remaining government structure and any semblance of social order for the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip is in those 25% of the areas that have not been evacuated until now, and specifically the central areas of Deir el-Balah. The possibility of those areas being taken over by the IDF and the collapse of the Hamas-led government in Gaza raised alarm bells about a complete collapse of the entire social and governing structure in the Gaza Strip. Again, it's important to remember that Hamas, in addition to the Al-Qassam brigades, also operated all the government ministries, including all of the economy, all the banking services, all the administration. This would either lead to a complete breakdown and an almost Afghanistan-style warlord situation in the Gaza Strip, or in turn, it may lead the IDF to establish a military government, since there's going to be no actual government apparatus remaining of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. In addition to that, the third facet that has been raised in the criticism is the nature of the evacuation. Until now in the Gaza Strip, Palestinian civilian population has been, quote-unquote, advised to evacuate the different areas, with the Israeli military declaring that those areas are going to become active fighting zones. However, the way the operation is currently being worded, it says that the entire regions are going to be placed under siege that would essentially force the Palestinian population either to leave those areas or to face starvation, which itself is considered a war crime, using starvation as a method of war. In a moment of analysis, I'm also going to add that despite that it has not been mentioned, the current plan bears a great resemblance to what has been known in Israel as the quote-unquote General's Plan, which was a proposal to insulate and completely besiege the northern areas of the Gaza Strip in order to force the Palestinian population to go southward. This plan was initially developed in the middle and end of 2024. I'll say I'm not going to elaborate on it now. Back in November of 2024, I published a special video about this plan. If you're interested in the details about it, click that first link that'll be in the comments, and you'll be able to see that video that talks a little bit more broadly about what this plan might involve. With regards to the actual condemnations that have come in of this plan in the last several days, on the international levels, multitudes of actors have expressed grave concern over the repeated mobilization of close to 1 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And there's also been a lot of skepticism that was raised about Israel's ability or desire to establish appropriate humanitarian conditions in the areas that Palestinians will be diverted to. Until now, until the moment I recorded this, countries that have condemned the plan include the United Kingdom, Denmark, Belgium, Holland, Slovenia, Spain, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Australia, Germany, Italy, and New Zealand, as well as the United Nations. Turkey also called upon all Muslim countries to cooperate in stopping Israel's plans, and the UN Security Council also convened for a special session in order to discuss this plan. In addition to that, in Israel, the plan also fell under heavy criticism from nearly the entire security establishment, with the heads of the Mossad, the IDF, and the Shabak stating in the cabinet meeting that approved this that they are against this plan, as it will be an unbearable strain on the Israeli military and will also put the hostages that remain in the Gaza Strip at grave risk. According to reports, the IDF Chief of Staff, Eyal Zamir, stated in cabinet that the military is stretched too thin as it is and is in great fatigue, and he also added that the military will not be able to administer such a humanitarian endeavor for the entire Palestinian population. It's also important to note that Zamir emphasized in that cabinet meeting that the military cannot carry out this operation without risking the hostages that remain in the Gaza Strip. He stated that both the hostages may be killed by the IDF activity, as well as they may be executed by their captors if the military invades those different areas. And according to reports, he went as far as to say in cabinet that if the Israeli government approves this plan, then the government should remove rescuing the hostages from the defined war aims, since the military cannot achieve rescuing the hostages alongside achieving the aims of this new plan. The plan was similarly heavily criticized by the family members of hostages and their supporters in Israel, saying that the plan constitutes a death sentence for the remaining hostages in the Gaza Strip. So, where do things stand at the moment with regards to the implementation of this plan and the fighting? On the one hand, the plan has been approved by the Israeli government, and the Israeli military, according to reports, is beginning planning how this plan is going to be implemented. According to reports, it is going to be gradually deployed over the next several months, starting with that gradual evacuation of Palestinians from northern Gaza, culminating in sometime in the middle to end of October, when the Israeli military will actually invade that area of Gaza City. On the other hand, it's also important to note that despite this approval, there are also continuous leaks being published from Israel that if Hamas accepts the hostage deal on Israel's terms, then the plan can be halted at any time. It's also important to note that during that government meeting, Israel outlined its terms for ending the war, i.e. the terms that Hamas would need to accept. Those include disarming Hamas, returning all living and dead hostages, demilitarizing the Gaza Strip, Israel maintaining complete security control over Gaza, and the establishment of a civil government in Gaza that does not include Hamas and does not include the Palestinian Authority. With this, Israel is seemingly attempting to apply pressure on Hamas and, quote-unquote, give it an out in the form of accepting Israel's terms in exchange for stopping the military plans. At this point, it's important to note, however, that the sides remain in complete stalemate in the negotiations. It's very difficult to see a scenario where Hamas does come back and completely accepts Israel's demands as they have been laid out. At the same time, it's also important to note that if Hamas would come back to the negotiating table and say it's willing to accept some of those terms, it is possible the negotiating countries would then apply pressure on Israel to say stop the advancement of this plan and come back to the ongoing discussions. There have been increasing rumors over the last several days, ever since the Israeli cabinet started discussing this plan, that the negotiating countries are starting to work on a new formula to try to bring both sides back to the negotiating table and negotiate a complete ceasefire and an end to the war. According to some reports, Qatar and Egypt have tried to develop a plan that both Hamas and Israel could live with, and then presented it to the U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff during a meeting that happened with the Qatari Prime Minister Mohammed Athani on August 9th. At this point, that is all rumors. Obviously, it remains to be seen. I'll report more as things develop. The way things stand right now, the Israeli military is beginning to try to figure out how it's going to implement this plan. We'll learn more about this in the coming days. Alongside the approval of this plan, fighting has continued in the Gaza Strip over the past week, with substantial events taking place throughout the Strip, both in northern, central, and southern regions. In the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, Darj Tufts was one of the particularly intensive areas over the past week. On August 6th and August 7th, the Al-Qassam brigades reported targeting IDF bulldozers with anti-tank missiles and firing mortars at IDF troops. The Israeli military issued new evacuation orders in the area on the following day, and massive airstrikes were reported throughout the entire region on that following day. In southern Gaza, the Al-Quds brigades of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad reported the joint attack that the group carried out with the Al-Qassam brigades in the Nasser region, that is in the northern parts of Han Yunis, according to reports that happened on August 5th. The following day, the IDF issued evacuation orders to the entire Nasser area, and substantial fighting was reported there over the next few days, including massive artillery fire that was reported on August 9th. In addition to this, in the central parts of the Gaza Strip, substantial airstrikes were reported in the areas of Deir el-Balach on August 6th, as well as in the areas of the Al-Nusayrat refugee camp on August 7th. Regarding casualties, 13 IDF soldiers were reported injured in the Gaza Strip over the past week, leaving the total number of IDF soldiers killed in the Gaza Strip since the invasion began on 454, and the total number of IDF soldiers injured in the Gaza Strip on 2,870. The Palestinian Health Ministry in the Gaza Strip reported in turn that 939 Palestinians were killed in the Gaza Strip over the past week, bringing the total number of Palestinians killed in the Gaza Strip since the war began to 61,639, and 152,359 Palestinians reported injured in the Gaza Strip since the war began. As I always remind everyone, the Palestinian Health Ministry in the Gaza Strip does not distinguish between militants and civilians. It simply accounts for the total number of Palestinians that have been processed as killed in the Gaza Strip since the war began. Meanwhile, on the humanitarian front, the substantial increase in humanitarian aid entering into the Gaza Strip continued over the past week, including both aid paradropping missions as well as an increase in the entrance of aid trucks. The number of trucks increased consistently over the past week, and according to some reports, averaged at around 300 trucks entering per day, with a noteworthy increase on August 7th when a convoy of 500 aid trucks that were donated by the United Arab Emirates passed through the Rafah crossing, reportedly carrying some 500 tons of food supplies entering into the Gaza Strip. At the same time, a series of countries joined in the aid paradropping missions, including Belgium and Italy, and Australia also announced on August 4th that it was donating $13 million worth of aid to Gaza. Regarding the impact of this increase of aid coming in, Al-Ahbar, which is a Lebanese news outlet which is somewhat affiliated with Hezbollah, reported on August 6th for the first time that the prices of food in Gaza markets began dropping in the last several days. And even though they are still 100 times higher than they were prior to the war, that trajectory of prices dropping is an indication that food increases are starting to reach the markets in the Gaza Strip. At the same time, however, there were also continued reports over the last week that over 40 people in the Gaza Strip, including a lot of children, died from malnutrition throughout the Strip, as well as reports that over 100 people were killed in different aid sites as they were trying to reach either humanitarian aid trucks or those sites of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. The United Nations also published a report on August 8th showing that a study that was done in the Gaza Strip stated that throughout June and July, some 18% of children in Gaza were in a state of severe acute malnutrition, up from 12% during the months of March through May of this year. At the moment, there is an increase in aid that is coming into the Gaza Strip. However, like when there was a blockade of aid that came in from March to May, we only saw really the devastating results that happened in the months of June and July. Similarly, with the increase of aid that is coming in, if there are results, we are likely to see the major impact that starts to happen only in the coming weeks throughout August and September. Before I conclude, I'm going to add another note about a development that happened in Israel's northern front in relation to Hezbollah. During the past week, the Lebanese government accepted a 4-phase plan that was proposed by the United States, aimed at disarming Hezbollah and granting the Lebanese military the sole monopoly over arms in the country for the first time. This came after a series of internal political pressures and external pressures from the United States. And while the first phase of this plan involves a military simply developing a plan to disarm Hezbollah by the end of 2025, it is still, I'll say again, the first time that the government has adopted such a move, reflecting the substantially changed balance of power in Lebanon and the increase in the anti-Hezbollah camp and the strength of the Lebanese military, as opposed to Hezbollah's both political wing and its military wing. I'm not going to develop this further at this point, but I will say that I both discussed this in an interview that I gave on August 7th, and I also wrote an op-ed comparing Israel's war with Hamas and with Hezbollah and Iran in the times of Israel. You can find links to both of those things in that first comment below. That concludes my weekly summary in the Israel-Palestine report. If you find these reports informative, please do remember to send them on to anyone you think might be interested in developments in the region. Hit that like button, subscribe, turn on notifications if you want to know when reports come out. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I'm Alon Burstein. I'm a visiting assistant professor and Israel Institute fellow in the Department of Political Science at Tufts University. Thanks for watching.